All right, so today, what I'm going to try to do with my time is convey a fairly simple message, I hope. And I don't think anybody in the room would probably disagree that poor biosecurity in the wean-to-market phase contributes in some way to mortality, right? I don't think that's probably debatable. What I think is debatable is how much, right? And I think that the case I want to make today is that it's probably a lot more significant than we think. And Dr. Talbot yesterday afternoon brought up this idea that one of the things that happens when we have virus, other pathogens spreading in the wean-to-market phase is that puts a lot of those pathogens out in the environment, puts our sow farms at risk, right? And I think that's something we probably underestimate how significant that is. And in some ways it's hard to assess that, but I think there is some evidence that I'm going to present that does support the idea that that's probably a real thing. And what it does is really create this kind of vicious cycle. And Edison did a nice job here, I think, of demonstrating that sow farms are not like Las Vegas, right? What happens on the sow farms doesn't stay on the sow farms. It has an effect all the way down, right? So, and so that's the vicious cycle, right? We have these groups of wean-to-market pigs that break, right? They're putting virus out in the environment, that puts pressure on our sow farms, they break. We produce positive pigs, puts more virus out in the environment, right? And the effect on mortality, the damage it does in terms of mortality, is all the way through that, right? It's just a vicious cycle. So that I think, in a nutshell, is what I'm going to try to convince you of today here. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about maybe what we can do about that. The other thing I'm going to try to make the case for is that the current state of affairs with wean-to-market biosecurity is not good, right? I think we've got, the good news is we got a lot of room for improvement, right? And so I've got a couple slides on that as well. So let's start by defining biosecurity. Butch Baker put this definition together about 10 years ago, a little over that now, and I really like it. I think it clarifies, in my mind at least, what we mean by biosecurity. Sometimes we use that term kind of loosely, but it really is made up of three components. The first is bioexclusion, right? And that's things we do to keep pathogens out of a population where they're not already there, right? Or in the case of PRRS, because we have different isolates, right? Doesn't matter if we already have, we want to keep PRRS virus out, right? Biomanagement is things we do once we have those pathogens in the population, right? Then we try to manage those in some way with immunity or reducing, within population or within herd transmission. That's biomanagement, okay? And then finally, biocontainment. And that's biocontainment is a term every lab rat would understand, right? Especially if they work with viruses or pathogens. But in the pig world, that's something we haven't given a lot of thought to, right? But the idea with biocontainment is not letting these pathogens get out into the environment, right? And that's an area where, as I've had the opportunity to do a lot of outbreak investigations on sow farms over the last several years, and more I'm starting to realize that, holy cow, this is a problem, right? This lack of attention to biocontainment, I think, is creating some problems for us, both in the on the south side as well as wean-to-market. And so what are the things in terms of pathogens and that we worry about or that we can do something about with biosecurity, specifically bioexclusion, I guess? And those would be the pathogens that we can get rid of, right? Or we can exclude from herds. And at the top of the list there, you got PRRS virus and PED virus, right? Those are probably our number one, number two enemy here today. And both of those we can eliminate from populations, and we like to keep them out. PRRS, as I mentioned before, even if we currently have it, we want to keep it out because we could get different isolates and still have problems. So PRRS is a trickier one. And then I think this is something I hope we're all have on the top of our minds, and that is that bioexclusion at the farm level is the last line of defense against foreign animal disease, right? I'd ask for a show of hands, but I suspect everybody would raise their hands. How many of you think in the last 5 years one of these foreign animal diseases has been on our soil? I'd say it's a pretty good bet, right? Hasn't got into pigs though, right? So our last line of defense is held up, right? So, when you think about that, not ignoring, but paying less attention to biosecurity in the wean-to-market phase is probably not a good strategy if we want to keep it out. And I want to remind you here too, PED virus, a lot of times I think we kind of forget this, but PED virus, when it came into the US in 2013, the evidence suggests that the index case, the first place it got was wean to finish, right? It wasn't until about a month and a half later, it finally got into a sow farm, looked like TGE. Diagnostics said it's not TGE. What is it? They did the full investigation. Oh, it's PED virus, right? Went back retrospectively, looked at samples they had stored, tested them for PED, and lo and behold, yeah, it was there, right? It was probably there for a good 4 to 6 weeks in the grow finish, maybe longer. And so, again, that weak biosecurity in the wean to market phase creates a big hole in the fortress there, right, in that last line of defense. And so I think if no other reason, that's probably a good enough reason to start focusing more on biosecurity in the wean to market phase. But so I want to talk a little bit then again about this, what is the impact, right, of bio-exclusion or biosecurity in general in the wean to market phase. And again, there's this direct impact, and I think we all acknowledge that, right? When we get these pathogens introduced into populations of pigs, it's going to maybe cause some mortality in some cases. I'll talk a little bit about kind of the specific cases where that probably happens to a more significant extent. But then the other is the indirect effect, right? That we put these sow farms more at risk. And I really believe, I'm to the point where I believe that until we get a handle on biosecurity in the wean to market phase, we're just not going to make much progress in the sow phase, right? We're just going to continue to have these outbreaks of PRRS virus, outbreaks at PED every year because we're just putting too much pressure on them, right? We can do a lot with biosecurity, but we can't do that much, right? We just can't withstand that much pressure, right? So I believe that. That's really not the main focus of my talk today here, but I do think that's real. I want to go back to the fundamentals here, right? It's always good to kind of think about that when you think about how does disease kill pigs or why does disease kill pigs, I guess. This is something I think, hopefully you've seen before, but it's a very basic concept, right? It's this epidemiological triad where when we think about how disease occurs or how it manifests itself and then how pigs die as a result, it's really a result of the interaction between the host, which in our case is the pig, the environment, and then the pathogens themselves, okay? And it's not just one of those in isolation, it's that interaction, right? And so to me, what that translates into is that, pigs don't die from moderate stressors, generally, right? Unless they have something else wrong with them. Pigs don't die from isolated pathogen challenges. African swine fever would be probably the exception to that. Maybe there's others, but generally that's the case. But pigs do die from severe stressors or multiple pathogen challenges, right? Pigs are pretty adaptable, right? It takes a lot to kill one, generally, but we seem to find ways to do that. But it takes more than just one bad thing happen. It's combinations of things, and it's important, I think, to keep that in mind. A couple studies to kind of demonstrate that. This one's fairly old, but I think it's been cited, still cited a lot, so I'm gonna use it here too. But this was done by Kara Dykhuis, now Hayden. Married name is Hayden. But this was done when she was a veterinary student on a summer internship. She was with the summer veterinary internship program. Did this study. So Tom Fangman here earlier. I don't know if he's in the audience, but he was involved in this project as well. But what she did was she collected closeouts for groups of pigs, and then also combined that then with diagnostic data for those groups of pigs, right? And fairly simply just said if there was no diagnostic evidence of any of these pathogens being present in that group, she considered that baseline, so no pathogens involved. On the other hand, if there were some results that indicate Mycoplasma pneumoniae was involved here, or PRRS virus, or combinations of pathogens were involved, then she sort of classified those groups accordingly. And so what you're looking at here in this table here then is the difference from the baseline in the mortality culls and tail enders, right? So this is comparing to the closeouts that didn't have any diagnostics suggesting there was some pathogens involved there. And so what you can see there then is when you have single pathogens at work there, Mycoplasma pneumoniae or PRRS virus or swine influenza virus, you see a little bump in mortality, right? And maybe even a little change in average daily gain. And she put an economic value on that as well over there in the right-hand column. But that's not going to bankrupt anybody probably. But when you start looking at the combinations of pathogens, so when you got PRRS virus and Mycoplasma pneumoniae working together, right? Or PRRS and SIV. That's where you start to see the big bump up in influenza. It's not linear, right? It goes along, and then as we challenge that pig with multiple challenges, pathogen challenges, it starts to get bad fast, right? Another study that one of our students did, Rachel Stitka She presented this a couple of years ago at the European Symposium of Porcine Health Management. Probably did a little bit better job here of sort of characterizing exactly what that pathogen burden looked like, rather than just say, is it there or not. What she did was she collected oral fluids or had somebody collect oral fluids every other week from groups of pigs, and then ran PCRs on those pathogens listed there: PRRS virus, influenza, Mycoplasma pneumonia, and the porcine circle virus. Okay, and then on the right there, what you see, there's three charts there. I'm going to use that bottom one to kind of illustrate. They're all three the same in terms of the axes, but on the horizontal axis there, you have the week, right? And then on the vertical axis, you have the percent of weekly oral fluid samples that were positive for that pathogen. And in this case, what I'm showing here is for influenza. Okay, she did the same thing for all four of those listed there. All right, and so then what she did next then was take those groups of pigs, and you can see in the background, it's not showing up on my screen, but hopefully it does on yours. There's little lighter lines behind that, or on both sides of that the black lines there, kind of dashed lighter lines. Each one of those lighter lines represents a individual group of pigs, right? What that dark line represents is the result of this k-means clustering. So what k-means clustering does is it takes all those groups of pigs and tries to put them together with the ones that are most like each other, basically, right? And you can specify whether you want 2 clusters or 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever. Somewhat subjective how your choice of that, but we went with 3 here. And so those were, for influenza, those were the 3 clusters that k-means clustering came up with. And you can see the individual results behind it. And so each one of them then in some way represents sort of the pathogen burden. There's a pattern there we're looking at, right? Now, the problem is with that, we don't quite know what does that mean, right? We don't exactly know if this is a more significant pathogen burden than another one. And so what we did is simply reorder them by mortality, right? And so the third cluster there, the red in each case, you're looking at all 4 pathogens here, but the red clusters for each pathogen represents the cluster that had the highest mortality, okay? And that's either 3 or red, right? The yellow, represented by the number 2, was the medium, and then the green, number 1, was the lowest mortality. So, right. So again, we did this for all 4 of those pathogens. And then to get to the chase here, then she sort of put this table together and struggled a bit with how to summarize this, but this was a table then that sort of summarized the results, mortality. What you're looking at, the numbers in that table are the wean to market mortality, and then the number of groups that were in that category is in parentheses. And so, for example, here in the top left-hand corner there, right, you have 2 groups of pigs that were in cluster 1 for all 4 pathogens, okay? So the low pathogen burden cluster for all 4 pathogens. And wean to market mortality was only 2.5%, okay? That, most of us, I think, would agree that that's pretty good. On the other end of the scale, though, you've got, again, 2 groups that fell into that category where they were in cluster 3 for all 4 of the pathogens. Okay, cluster 3 for PRRS virus, cluster 3 for influenza, and so forth. Okay, so the worst one, and mortality there jumps up to 26.2. Right. So again, not just simply a linear. That's where I call those train wrecks. Those train wrecks happen right when we just overwhelm the pigs. Right. We hit that threshold where they just can't handle it anymore. The other thing she did that I thought was that I really thought was interesting. And Dr. Rodemaker presented this yesterday afternoon as well, I think just looking strictly at stocking density, the relationship between wean to market mortality and stocking density, right? And if you missed it or don't recall, that there's a positive relationship, upward sloping line there, meaning that as stocking density goes up, wean to market mortality goes up. Now in this data set, Rachel had, she didn't have the exact square feet per pig for every case, but she did have what essentially is an index. So they had a sort of a target stocking density, and if they stock the pigs at that target, then they're at 100%. If they overstock, they're at 110%, they're 10% over their target, right? 90%, they're 10% under. And so it's a little crude, it's not exactly by square feet, but it gives you the idea here. And so what's interesting is, first of all, the difference in slope between those 3 different clusters here, which she did, I'm sorry, I missed a step. She plotted these then and ran regression analysis, linear regression, for each cluster, each pathogen burden cluster individually, right? So not looking at it all together, but each one individually. And so what you see there is the yellow line represents the relationship between mortality and stocking density for the medium and pathogen burden, and the low is the green line, right? And so the slopes were different, statistically significantly different, and the big difference here is is 3, right? The groups of pigs that were in pathogen burden category 3 there. And so what that suggests is then that, yeah, stocking density matters, but it really matters the most when we challenge pigs with pathogen and overstock. Okay, that's when, again, the wheels fall off, right? And in this case, it's for influenza, right? She did this for all 4 pathogens, and it looked very similar in all 4 of them. It was even more pronounced for Mycoplasma pneumoniae. But again, to me, it just really nicely illustrates that, you know, we can get by with mistakes. It's when we compound our mistakes, multiple mistakes, where we pay the price, right? All right, and again, it goes back to that epidemiological triad. Very good example here, again, how in this case, the stressor is the stocking density, right? That's part of the environment. And again, then the pathogens measured by the pathogen burden there, those two are interacting to really make us pay a price in terms of mortality there. All right, so a little bit now on the indirect effect. This is, again, trying to make the case that in theory, this seems to make sense, right? At least it does to me. But I think that we have some evidence now to suggest that, yeah, this is a real deal. And so the idea here is that every time we have a group of pigs either place positive or they become positive during the growing phase, they're going to spit out a lot of virus or bacteria or whatever we're worried about there, right? And that looks like it's going through the air, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be air. That's probably not the major way it's going to get into the environment. But it's going to do it by people, by trucks and trailers, by feed trucks, by dead haul, right? That's what each of those little dots spraying out, that's what that looks like. So, but we're just putting a lot of those pathogens out into the environment, and that's even worse in pig dense areas. So, and so here in my mind, this is some of the strongest evidence I've seen so far to kind of support this theory. Let's call it our hypothesis, and that is that let me back up. What this is from the chart from the swine disease reporting system that Dr. Lynn Harris and Dr. Giovanni Trevisan put out monthly. You can see the link at the bottom there. You can also go to SHIC's website, I think, right, swinehealth.org, and there's a link to this there as well. Put it out monthly. And what's on this chart then, there's several charts in that report, but this chart shows the percent positive on the vertical axis there, and then across the horizontal axis is time, each month, right? And so what they do is they plot both for wean to market, the percent that's positive, that's the red line, and then the samples that come from sow farms, the percent that is positive is plotted with the blue line, okay? And so this is a rough indicator then of basically how much virus do we have out there, right? Or how often are we finding it, right? So a bit crude, but it still, I think, gives a pretty good idea. And so when you look at, and Dr. Rodemaker presented this yesterday too, but if you look at the patterns there, so hopefully you can see in 2020, we started to see a bump up in wean to market, start in July, August there, and then shortly after that we started to see it, maybe a month behind we saw it in the sow farms, the blue line. More so pronounced in 2019. There's really about a 2-month lag there almost between when it started to rise in the red line, which is the wean to market, and the blue on the sow farm, right? So, and then it happened in 2018 as well. And so we get this recurring pattern where essentially we start to see activity in the wean to market phase come in the late summer, early fall, and then a month and a half later, it gets to the sow farm, right? And that kind of, again, it's not a definitive proof, but it certainly provides evidence, in my opinion, that is a real thing, that we are putting our sow farms at risk when we start to break more and more of these groups of growing pigs. And so, again, this is a failure both of bioexclusion and biocontainment, right? If we place those pigs negative for something and then the virus gets in there, that's a failure of bioexclusion, and then we don't contain it, that's a failure of biocontainment, and then it gets into our sow farms, and that's a failure of bioexclusion, right? And there's that vicious cycle again, right? So, that continuous failure of both biocontainment and bioexclusion sets this up. And you see the same thing here. This is another chart from the swine disease reporting system where late spring, this past spring, early fall here, we saw a big run-up spike in the number of outbreaks, especially up in south central, north central Iowa. But we didn't see the spike in sow farms until about May there. Okay, and so what you're looking at there is a number of OR5 sequences that were identified. The red is the wean to market again, and the blue is the sow farm there. And so, you know, we didn't start to see that bump up in outbreaks in sow farms until about May, right? But that was preceded by about a month when we started to see a lot more of that virus in wean to finish, right? So I think it's, in my mind, it's pretty easy to make that case that, yeah, that virus started out in wean to market and eventually made its way into the sow farms, right? So this year, not quite yet there where we're ready to say, you know, it looks like that's going up, at least on this chart. But Dr. Linares told me on the way over here that it's looking like starting to see a lot more activity in that wean to market now for the report that'll be coming out in this next month, a week or so, I guess, right? And so hold on to your socks there. I think we're off again here. And then finally, this slide I want to use to make the case that our current state of biosecurity might not be that good, and we got lots of room for improvement there. This is a study that Dr. Kate Dion is working with. She's currently full-time veterinarian for Hanover, but she's also working on her master's and now PhD. And so, by the way, if anybody in the audience, any veterinarians that think they haven't had enough education yet or want to take more classes, you can do that. Most of the courses she's taken, all of them really are online, and then she's doing a research and collaboration. It's really, I enjoy working with her on this because it's independently, neither one of us could probably get this done, but working together we can get it done. And she's working with Dr. Linares and I, are co-mentoring her on her PhD, and so she'll hopefully have a PhD at the end of this too. So, but what she did was she enrolled 75 groups of pigs that were all negative for PRRS virus, porcine delta coronavirus, PED virus, and TGE virus, okay? And none of them were vaccinated, so all negative, all not vaccinated, so we could use PCR to monitor when they went positive, right? And that's gonna suggest that there was an introduction of one of those viruses, right? She tests them by oral fluids every other week. She's done that all the way through. This study, by the way, is just wrapping up. And then when we find positives on PCR, that's indicated they went positive for that pathogen, right? And now, maybe not surprising, these farms are located in northwest Iowa, so that sort of does taint, that's a very pig-dense area, does taint these results a little bit maybe, but the number I want to highlight there is that number, okay? Out of 75 groups that were placed, all negative for PRRS, not vaccinated, 73 of those went positive, okay? And the one of those two that didn't go positive is still active, actually. It's the last group that hasn't closed out yet. And so there's a chance that we may only end up with one, right? But that's not good, right? I mean, that basically says that, you know, that's a near 100% failure rate in terms of keeping PRRS virus out. A little bit better for PED virus. Porcine delta coronavirus, about 25% of the groups went positive for that. TGE, we didn't see any, right? So TGE might be one of those that, if we need to, it might be time to eradicate that one. It's getting so low. So to wrap up, you know, that again, I think pretty compelling evidence in my mind, or some evidence in my mind, to indicate that we underestimate the impact of poor biosecurity in wean-to-market phase on mortality. Okay, and I think there's an opportunity really to get on top of that, and then because of the current lack of biosecurity, let's say in wean-to-market, there's a big opportunity there to prove that as well. So, real briefly, how we do that? Well, I personally think this is a lot of this has to do with vigilance, right, and how we respond to fear or crises, or fear crises. And you know, you can look at this Minnesota Swine Health Monitoring Project data, which reports outbreaks in sow farms, and it's pretty clear that when PD came into the U.S., everybody got pretty worked up about that, and improved biosecurity and PRRS outbreaks went down for about 2 or 3 years, and then they started going back up in sow farms. And then African swine fever came along in China, and that freaked everybody out again, and so biosecurity got better. And so outbreaks of PRRS virus has gone down again, right? So we're probably hitting about the time where we should be getting complacent again, and it should start going up, right? And so, I think in my mind, it's about maintaining a more steady level of vigilance, right, of concern. And so we've been doing a lot of hazard analysis, right? Just going out, trying to identify where the hazards are, trying to do that on a regular basis. That really works well in the context of outbreak investigations, but you can do them anytime. And just, I think what that can do, I think, for us is, again, give us a steady level of concern and attention to biosecurity. Today, we're too manic depressive about it, right? We get worked up when something bad happens, and then we forget about it for a while. And I think it's just one of those things where, we're probably not going to motivate people with cost-benefit analysis and ROI. It's too hard to calculate that. But fear of a crisis, I think those are things that motivate. So that's the idea, to work around that and try to figure out how we can use that to our advantage. So, Chris, with that, I guess I'll just stop talking.